I built what I thought was the perfect marriage with Arthur. 37 years of what everyone called a fairy tale relationship. The kind other couples envied at dinner parties and church gatherings. Arthur was the dependable provider. I was the devoted wife who kept our home running like clockwork. And together we raised 5 beautiful children who were the pride of our community. Everyone said we were couple goals, the ones who made it look effortless. Arthur had always been close with his best friend, Julian, since childhood. They'd grown up on the same street, been each other's best man, and our families naturally gravitated toward each other over the years. Julian and his wife, Clara, had kids around the same ages as ours, so family vacations together just made sense. It was economical. The kids had playmates, and the adults could actually relax knowing there were extra hands to help with supervision. The only real tension in our early marriage came from Arthur's stubborn pride about his family. His brother Silas had made some inappropriate comments about me when we were dating, suggesting I was too high maintenance for someone like Arthur. Instead of defending me properly, Arthur had just cut Silas out of our lives entirely. I tried to tell Arthur that holding grudges wasn't healthy, but he insisted that anyone who couldn't respect his wife didn't deserve to be in our lives. It was sweet in theory, but I always thought he was being overly dramatic about the whole thing. When the kids were in middle and junior high school, we planned our annual summer vacation to Florida with Julian's family. It was going to be our biggest trip yet. A beautiful rental house right on the beach, with enough room for everyone to spread out and really enjoy themselves. I'd been looking forward to it for months, especially because Arthur had been working such long hours at the store that we barely had time to connect anymore. The vacation started perfectly. The kids were thrilled with the beach access. The house was even more gorgeous than the photos, and for the first few days, it felt like exactly the reset our family needed. But as the week went on, I started noticing how Arthur threw himself into every single activity with an almost manic energy. Beach volleyball, fishing expeditions, elaborate sandcastle competitions with the kids. He was constantly in motion, constantly organizing the next adventure. Don't get me wrong, it was wonderful seeing him so engaged with the family, but there was something almost compulsive about it. Even during our supposedly relaxing evening hours, he'd be planning the next day's activities or researching local attractions on his phone. I began to feel like I was competing with his endless to-do list for even 5 minutes of his attention. Julian, on the other hand, seemed much more present and available for actual conversation. While Arthur was busy being the cruise director for our little group, Julian would sit with me on the porch in the evenings, asking about my thoughts on books I'd been reading or really listening when I talked about the kids' school situations. It was the kind of attentive conversation I'd been craving from Arthur for months. By the last night of our vacation, I was feeling genuinely lonely despite being surrounded by family. Arthur and Clara had both gone to bed early, exhausted from another full day of Arthur's scheduled activities. But Julian and I found ourselves alone on the porch with a bottle of wine and the peaceful sound of ocean waves. The conversation flowed so naturally between us. Julian told me how much he admired the way I managed our household and supported Arthur's business, how he'd always thought I was remarkably insightful about people and situations. It had been so long since anyone had really seen me as more than just Arthur's wife or the kids' mother. The wine, the romantic setting, the gentle sea breeze, everything felt surreal and perfect. When Julian suggested we move up to the attic space to look at the stars through the skylight, it seemed like such an innocent extension of our conversation. We were both adults, both married to people we cared about, both just enjoying a rare moment of genuine connection. But somehow in that quiet space away from everyone else, the energy between us shifted into something neither of us had planned. The attraction that had been building all week suddenly felt overwhelming and mutual. When he kissed me, it didn't feel wrong. It felt like something that had been inevitable from the moment we'd really started talking. What happened between us that night was beautiful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't some sordid affair or calculated betrayal. It was 2 people who genuinely cared about each other sharing an intimate moment that felt completely natural given the circumstances. We were both swept up in the romance of the setting, the wine, the emotional connection we discovered. Afterward, we both felt the weight of what we'd done immediately. Julian was visibly shaken, talking about how much he loved Clara and how this could never happen again. I felt the same way about Arthur. We agreed that this had been a moment of weakness brought on by the unique circumstances, and that we'd never speak of it again out of respect for our spouses and families. The next morning was awkward, but we managed to get through the packing and travel arrangements without anyone noticing anything unusual. Julian and I were careful not to make eye contact or have any private conversations. And by the time we parted ways at the airport, I think we both believed we could simply put the whole thing behind us. But as the months and years passed, the guilt began eating away at me in ways I hadn't expected. Every time Arthur mentioned Julian or we socialized with their family, I felt the weight of that secret growing heavier. It wasn't that I regretted the connection Julian and I had shared. In many ways, it had been one of the most emotionally fulfilling experiences of my adult life. But I hated having this barrier between Arthur and me. I started reading articles about marriages that had survived infidelity, and everything I read suggested that honesty was the foundation of truly strong relationships. Couples who worked through these kinds of challenges often emerged with deeper intimacy and better communication than they'd had before. I began to believe that telling Arthur about that night might actually strengthen our marriage in the long run. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that Arthur and I had the kind of solid foundation that could weather this kind of revelation. We'd been through so many challenges together. Financial struggles when the kids were young, health scares with both sets of parents, the normal ups and downs of raising 5 children, and we'd always come out stronger on the other side. I also knew that Arthur valued honesty above almost everything else. It was one of the things I'd always admired about him, how straightforward and genuine he was in all his dealings. I started to feel like I was dishonoring that part of him by keeping this secret, like I was treating him as if he couldn't handle the truth about our marriage. The years passed, and our relationship continued to evolve and deepen in beautiful ways. We watched our children grow into remarkable adults, celebrated graduations and career achievements, and eventually started looking forward to grandchildren and the next phase of our lives together. Every milestone made me more confident that our marriage was strong enough to handle complete honesty about our past. When our youngest daughter, Cora, announced her engagement, I felt like it was a sign that our family was entering a new chapter of openness and maturity. Watching her plan her wedding with such joy and optimism reminded me of our own wedding day, and how we'd promised to share everything with each other, to have no secrets between us. The wedding itself was absolutely magical. Cora looked radiant. Her fiancé was clearly devoted to her, and the whole celebration felt like a testament to the kind of love that could overcome any obstacle. Arthur and I danced together at the reception, and I felt more connected to him than I had in years. He kept whispering sweet things in my ear about how proud he was of our family, how grateful he was for the life we'd built together. That night, we found ourselves alone on the resort rooftop, looking out over the lights of the city and talking about how blessed we felt. The setting was incredibly romantic, and Arthur was being more affectionate and sentimental than he'd been in months. It felt like the perfect moment to finally clear the air between us, to start this new phase of our marriage with complete honesty. "I want to tell you something that has been eating me for decades," I said, taking his hand and looking directly into his eyes. I wanted him to see how much courage this was taking, how much I trusted him with this vulnerable confession. Arthur's expression immediately became more serious, but he nodded encouragingly, squeezing my hand in a way that felt supportive. "Remember that trip with Julian and his family in Florida when the kids were in middle school?" I continued. "The last night when you and Clara went to sleep, Julian and I stayed up talking on the porch." I could see Arthur trying to place the memory, his brow furrowing slightly as he thought back to that vacation from so many years ago. We'd been drinking wine and having such a deep conversation, and we ended up going up to the attic to look at the stars, I said, speaking slowly and carefully because I wanted him to understand the context, the romantic circumstances that had led to what happened. "We got distracted." "What does that mean?" Arthur asked. And I could hear a note of weariness creeping into his voice that I hadn't expected. "We ended up being intimate," I said gently. "But I promise it was just one time, and we were both extremely guilty about it afterward. We never spoke of it again, and it never happened again. I've been carrying this guilt for 15 years, and I just felt like you deserved to know the truth." The change in Arthur's demeanor was immediate and shocking. He dropped my hand like it had burned him and physically recoiled from me, his whole body language shifting from warm and loving to cold and distant in the space of a heartbeat. "Please talk to me," I said, reaching for him again. "Say what you're thinking." I thought our marriage was strong enough to sustain this kind of honesty. But Arthur just stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, like he was looking at a complete stranger instead of the woman he'd been married to for 37 years. "Let's rest," he finally said in a flat, emotionless voice. "I'm feeling dizzy from the travel." I was completely bewildered by his reaction. This wasn't at all how I'd imagined this conversation going. I'd expected him to be hurt, maybe even angry initially, but I'd also expected him to appreciate my honesty and want to work through this together. Instead, he seemed to be shutting down entirely. The rest of the night was terrible. Arthur turned away from me in bed and didn't respond when I tried to continue the conversation. I barely slept, running through everything I'd said and wondering if I'd explained it wrong somehow, if I'd failed to convey how much I loved him and how committed I was to our marriage. The next morning was even worse. We had to travel home with our son Leo's family, and Arthur maintained this awful polite distance, speaking to me only when absolutely necessary and avoiding any physical contact. Leo and his wife clearly sensed the tension but didn't know what to make of it, which made the whole trip feel surreal and uncomfortable. I kept expecting Arthur to want to talk once we got home to ask questions or express his feelings about what I'd told him, but instead, he seemed to be actively avoiding me. He started sleeping in the guest room, claiming he had a cold and didn't want to keep me awake with his coughing, but I could tell it was really about avoiding any intimate conversations. By the end of the week, I was starting to get genuinely angry about his behavior. Yes, what I told him was difficult to hear, but his dramatic reaction was starting to feel punitive and unfair. I'd been brave enough to be honest with him about something that had happened 15 years ago, and instead of appreciating that courage, he was treating me like I'd betrayed him yesterday. Then I started noticing other changes that were even more alarming. Arthur was having hushed phone conversations that he'd end abruptly when I walked into the room. He was spending unusual amounts of time at the store, and when I called there, his employees would say he'd just stepped out. Most concerning of all, I overheard him on the phone with someone talking about selling the business. When I confronted him about it, he just said he was exploring options and reconsidering priorities, but he wouldn't give me any real details. The man who had shared every business decision with me for decades was suddenly treating me like I had no right to know what was happening with our livelihood. The final shock came when I discovered he'd been in contact with his brother Silas, the same brother he'd refused to speak to for our entire marriage because of those comments about me when we were dating. Suddenly, Arthur was willing to reconcile with someone who disrespected his wife, but he couldn't have a mature conversation with the wife herself about something that had happened over a decade ago. I tried everything I could think of to break through this cold wall he erected between us. I wrote him letters explaining my feelings. I suggested marriage counseling. I even reached out to our pastor to see if he could help mediate a conversation between us. But Arthur ignored the letters, refused counseling, and told the pastor that he wasn't ready to discuss our situation with anyone. Then one morning, I woke up and Arthur was simply gone. Not just gone for the day, gone completely. His clothes, his personal items, everything that mattered to him had been removed from the house sometime during the night. He'd left no note, no explanation, no indication of where he was going or when he might be back. When I tried calling his phone, the number had been disconnected. When I checked his social media accounts, they'd all been deleted. It was like he decided to erase himself from our shared life completely. And he'd done it with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything else. The humiliation was unbearable. How was I supposed to explain to our children, to our friends, to our community, that my husband of 37 years had simply vanished? What was I supposed to say when people asked where Arthur was? That he'd abandoned his family because I'd been honest with him about one mistake from 15 years ago. The kids were devastated and confused. They kept asking what had happened, why Dad wouldn't return their calls, whether we were getting divorced. I tried to explain the situation in a way that didn't make Arthur look completely unreasonable. But honestly, how do you put a positive spin on a grown man running away from his responsibilities because his wife told him the truth about something that happened over a decade ago? Leo was particularly angry with his father, saying that whatever had happened between us, there was no excuse for Arthur to abandon his children and grandchildren. Cora was heartbroken that her wedding had somehow triggered this crisis, even though I kept reassuring her that this was about Arthur's inability to handle adult relationships, not about anything she'd done. Through some detective work involving Arthur's business contacts, the kids eventually figured out that he'd gone to stay with his brother Silas on the old family farm. But when they tried to contact him there, Silas claimed Arthur didn't want to speak to any of us. The man who had always preached about the importance of family was now hiding behind his estranged brother to avoid his own wife and children. The rejection was devastating, but I kept telling myself that this was just Arthur's way of processing difficult emotions. He'd always been someone who needed time and space to work through challenges. And I figured that eventually his natural love for his family would override whatever hurt feelings he was nursing about my confession. But weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, and Arthur maintained his ridiculous silence. He changed his phone number multiple times to avoid our attempts to contact him. He refused to attend any family gatherings, including birthdays, graduations, and holidays that had always been sacred to our family. He even missed the births of new grandchildren, which broke my heart for the kids who wanted their father to be part of these precious moments. The whole situation was so embarrassing and frustrating. People in our community started treating me with this mixture of pity and suspicion, like they couldn't figure out what I must have done to make such a devoted husband disappear completely. Some of our mutual friends clearly thought I wasn't telling them the whole story, that there must be more to Arthur's behavior than I was letting on. I tried to maintain some dignity throughout this whole ordeal, but it was incredibly difficult. I was dealing with the financial stress of Arthur having liquidated his business without consulting me, the social humiliation of being essentially abandoned, and the emotional pain of watching our children struggle with their father's rejection of the entire family. My health started deteriorating during this period, which wasn't surprising given the chronic stress I was under. I developed high blood pressure, had trouble sleeping, and started experiencing anxiety attacks whenever I had to explain Arthur's absence to people who asked about him. The doctor said my symptoms were consistent with someone dealing with prolonged emotional trauma, which felt like a dramatic way to describe being married to someone who couldn't handle honest communication. Meanwhile, I learned through mutual friends that Julian had also suffered consequences from that night in Florida. Though in his case, he'd apparently confessed to Clara shortly after Arthur disappeared. Clara had divorced him, and his children had been angry with him for several years, before eventually reconciling. It was validating in some ways to know that I wasn't the only one who'd paid a price for what happened. But it was also sad to see how one night of genuine connection had caused so much pain for so many people. The kids kept trying to convince Arthur to come home, especially as the years passed and it became clear that his absence was permanent rather than temporary. They'd drive out to Silas's farm and beg Arthur to at least have a conversation with me, to try counseling to consider the impact his behavior was having on his grandchildren who barely knew him. But Arthur was apparently completely unmoved by their pleas. According to the kids, he seemed content with his isolated life on the farm, and he refused to discuss our marriage or the possibility of reconciliation. It was like he decided that cutting his entire family out of his life was preferable to having one difficult conversation with his wife about something that had happened 15 years earlier. I started to realize that the man I'd been married to for 37 years was much more rigid and unforgiving than I'd ever understood. The Arthur I thought I knew would never have abandoned his children over a marital problem, no matter how hurt he felt. But apparently when push came to shove, Arthur's pride was more important to him than his family. As my health continued to decline, I began to wonder if the stress of Arthur's abandonment was literally killing me. I'd always been a healthy, energetic person, but the combination of financial worry, social isolation, and emotional rejection was wearing me down in ways I couldn't seem to recover from. When the doctors finally diagnosed me with a terminal illness 2 years ago, my first thought was that maybe this would finally make Arthur realize how foolish his behavior had been. Surely, when faced with the possibility of losing me forever, he'd want to reconcile and make peace with our past. The kids certainly thought so. They were devastated by my diagnosis, and they immediately started pressuring Arthur to come home and spend whatever time we had left together. They told him that regardless of whatever problems we'd had, I was still the mother of his children and the woman he'd spent most of his adult life with, and that he owed it to all of us to be present during this difficult time. Initially, Arthur refused even this request. According to Silas's daughter, who eventually became our go-between, Arthur said he was sorry to hear about my illness, but that he didn't think his presence would be helpful or welcome. It was like he'd convinced himself that I was better off without him when nothing could have been further from the truth. I was furious about his continued selfishness. Here I was facing the end of my life and he was still nursing his wounded pride over something that had happened 15 years earlier. What kind of person abandons their dying spouse over a decades-old mistake that had been honestly confessed? Finally, the kids gave Arthur an ultimatum. They told him that if he didn't come home to be with me during my final months, they would cut him out of their lives permanently. They said they couldn't respect a father who would let his wife die alone over something so petty and long ago. That threat finally got through to him. Apparently, Arthur came home, but his presence was cold and dutiful rather than loving or supportive. When I tried to talk to him about our years apart, about how much I'd missed him and regretted the pain my confession had caused, he'd just say things like, "I'm here, aren't I? And let's not talk about it." It was clear that he was only there because the kids had forced him to come, not because he'd actually forgiven me or wanted to reconcile. He was going through the motions of being a supportive husband, but emotionally, he was still as distant as he had been for all these years. Even on my deathbed, Arthur couldn't bring himself to have an honest conversation about what had happened between us. I kept apologizing, kept trying to explain how sorry I was for hurting him, how much I'd always loved him despite that one mistake. But he just changed the subject or find excuses to leave the room. The most heartbreaking part was when Julian came to visit me in the hospital. He'd heard about my illness through mutual friends, and he wanted to apologize for his role in the destruction of my marriage. Julian looked terrible. Clearly, the years had been hard on him, too. And he broke down crying as he told Arthur how sorry he was for what had happened that night in Florida. "I've regretted it every day for 15 years, Julian said to Arthur. I lost my marriage. My relationship with my kids was damaged for years, and I destroyed the best friendship I ever had. Eleanor paid an even higher price than I did, and she didn't deserve to spend the last years of her life abandoned and alone because of my selfishness." It was the first time I'd seen Arthur show any real emotion since he'd returned. He and Julian actually embraced, and Arthur told him that he forgave him and missed their friendship. It was beautiful to witness, but also incredibly painful because Arthur was able to forgive Julian in a way he'd never been able to forgive me. I died a month later, and with Arthur present, but still emotionally unavailable. My last words to him were another apology, another attempt to make him understand how much I'd always loved him. He just squeezed my hand and said, "I know, but I could tell that forgiveness was never really going to come." Now, it's been a month since my funeral, and according to what the kids have told me, Arthur inherited everything, but seems lost without the structure that our conflict provided him. He's apparently reconnected with Julian and some old friends, but he's struggling to find purpose in his life after spending years in isolation. The kids' relationships with him are slowly healing, but they're all still processing the reality that their father chose pride over family for more than a decade. Some of them have told him directly that while they're glad he was there for my final weeks, they can't understand or respect the choice he made to abandon all of us over something that happened so long ago. Looking back on everything that happened, I still believe that honesty was the right choice, even though it led to such painful consequences. A marriage built on secrets and lies isn't really a marriage at all, and I couldn't continue living with that barrier between Arthur and me. I just wish he'd been mature enough to work through the revelation instead of running away from his entire life. I hope that someday Arthur will understand that what happened with Julian wasn't a betrayal of our marriage, but rather a moment of human connection that occurred during a time when I felt emotionally neglected and lonely. I hope he'll realize that my decision to confess after 15 years was an act of love and trust, not a cruel attempt to hurt him. Most of all, I hope our children and grandchildren will remember me as someone who valued truth and authenticity in relationships, even when that commitment to honesty came at a tremendous personal cost. The alternative, living a lie for the rest of my life, would have been far worse than the pain we all endured because of Arthur's inability to forgive.